Day morning session of this National Workshop on Research Methodology, jointly conducted by the Indira Gandhi National Open University Regional Center Noida and NAS College Merit, Professor Maitrayee Chaudhuri. In this session, she would be talking on theory, methods, and empirical research. At present, Professor Maitrayee Chaudhuri has been teaching at the Center for the Study of Social Systems, Jawaharlal Nehru University since 1990. She was the coordinator of the Center for Advanced Studies, JNU, between 2012-2014. She was also the chairperson of the Center for the Study of Social Systems, JNU, between 2012-14. She was also the director of the Women's Studies Program of JNU between 2006-8. She was the coordinator of Global Studies Program of JNU in 2004-5 and 2018. She has been an active member of the Textbook Development Committee of the National Council for Education, Research and Training of India in 2005. She has written many books and research articles published on various renowned national and international journals. She has written widely on feminism, media, academia, and pedagogy. Some of her key publications include The Women's Movement in India, Reform and Revival 1993, The Practice of Sociology 2003, Feminism in India 2004, and Sociology in India, Intellectual and Institutional Trends 2010. Her most recent books are Refashioning India, Gender, Media and Public Discourse 2017 and Doing Theory 2018. She was the first professor of India chair, McGill University in 2015. She was also a visiting professor at Albert Ludwig University, Germany in 2003 and a visiting fellow at Harvard University and the University of Massachusetts in 1995-96. Recently, she has delivered a lecture on the topic Liberal Studies, Gender Studies, Multidisciplinary Literature, and the Question of Relevance at East-West University, Dhaka. She is an inspiring.
I think again, ma'am, we have lost Hemchand, but
okay, but can I share the screen? Because you know.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, you can.
Yeah.
Sorry, sir, disconnected.
No problem. Continue, Hemchand.
She is an inspiration to many people and academicians across the globe. I would like to say a quote on her. The empowered woman is powerful beyond measure and most beautiful beyond description. With these few words, let me invite the expert speaker of today's morning session, Professor Maitrayee Chaudhuri. Ma'am, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very, very generous introduction. First, my apologies for being technologically challenged. So it took me a little bit of time to get on, and I hope I haven't delayed you enough. And very good morning to everyone. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, particularly to Sanjeev. And Hemchandra, thank you for this generous introduction. As you have already told that today I'll be speaking on theory, method, and empirical research. May I share my slides, please?
Yeah, ma'am. Yeah, you can.
Yeah, so now it's there. Can you see it?
No, ma'am. No, not yet.
Okay, not yet?
Not yet.
Oh, what's that? I mean, you have to just open it, isn't it? That's all.
Yes.
I have opened it.
There is an option of share also. You have to share your screen from your side also.
Okay, share screen? Yes. Yes, and now I have to share.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
You got the slides?
Yeah, we got this. No, we got that screen in which my email was there. Yes, now we have got the slides.
Okay, so now it's all done.
Yeah.
So I think
full view, ma'am. The full view of the slides, please.
Is this better?
Yeah, it is better, ma'am.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah, so I have about 45 minutes.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. By now, I think the other experts have already spoken on specific topics like qualitative research, quantitative research, data analysis, research questions, research design. What I am coming through is more a kind of overview on theory, methods, and empirical research. And as my introduction says, I've been teaching for many years, and my interest in this particular way of giving this talk is to emphasize the interconnection, the connections between theory, method, and empirical research. The reason for the choice of topic is because usually we tend to treat each of them as different, both in our teaching as well as in our research. For example, in our syllabi, we will have paper on theory, we will teach structural functionalism, ethnomethodology, Indology, etc. On methods, we will have another techniques of research, quantitative, qualitative. And substantive, we'll have topics like caste in India, urban sociology, women in society, rural society. And normally, when we give a lecture or discuss, we don't connect it with questions of theory and methods. Those seem to be very discrete. Many decades ago, 4 decades to be precise, when I was a student of sociology in the early days, I used to always wonder, why do we do theory at all? I mean, is it relevant? Or when we did methods, the normal answer that why do you do method is that it has to be systematic. But systematic is very, very important, as all of you are more than aware. But there is a story more than that. And the story is that, are we not methodical when we normally observe in our everyday life what is called common sense sociology? Are we not systematic when we observe, when we participate, when we hear other people? What is different then between our common sense method of understanding reality in everyday life and sociological, social science way of looking at everyday life? After all, we run our lives, we are competent, active members of society. We know, like, I tried, I struggled, but I managed to come online finally. So we have our own ways and our methods of operating in everyday life. Why do we then need methods? Why can't we have a trial and error kind of system? Why can't we just observe and document? Look up and observe and count and say, look, this is what I have observed. What is the problem with that? And I remember this, whole question of, I think it was, now see the names also I forget, but the idea that you can observe empirical reality as a given. Say, for example, if I come into a classroom and I ask the students, take out your pen and paper, observe and write down what you observe. Now, usually people will take out their pen and paper, but after a second, they will ask, what do we observe? What is it that we have to observe? So when they say, what do you have to observe, mean there has to be a research question already in place. I can say, observe the ceiling, or I can say, observe the desk, or I can say, observe the students, or observe the teacher. Unless you have a kind of question, a query, a framework, you will not be able to observe in a particular fashion. The observation will be random. They will not be tied up in a particular framework. The observation will depend upon your natural inclination or your natural interest. For example, I know in the lockdown time, many of us are not getting the newspapers in its hard copy. But when you get a newspaper normal times, then you would notice that different family members look at different pages. So I may look at something which interests me. My children may look at the sports page. Somebody else may look at the advertisements to see whether there is a sale. Somebody else may move to see what are the new films in the town. Somebody else may want to look at the more gossipy columns, or maybe the page 4 of, on newspaper. What decides our interest? It is our personalities, our inclination, our socialization which are doing that. That means in our everyday life, we already have a framework through which we observe. The whole logic of inquiry of social sciences, the whole attempt by theory and methods is to make us aware and conscious of our what would be a natural way of looking at things and say, okay, this natural way of looking at things is actually not so natural, it is socially constructed. So theories and methods are making us not just a systematic, yes, systematic, but along with systematic, it is making us aware about the limits of objectivity and subjectivity, the limits of looking at reality in a particular way, and asking questions not only about what we study, but also why do we study it? Not just looking at theory and methods as fixed products. Okay, today we have to finish this topic, let us finish it. We have to look at them as processes. They have context. These theories and methods arise in particular historical contexts. They have context of production. For example, a particular tool of analysis arises in a society or in an academia in a particular period of time. They circulate at a particular period of time. They're received in a particular fashion. These terms, these points I put on the PPT may look a little, abstract. I'm now going to show through concrete example what I mean by saying that they are processes, they have context, there is a context of production, there is a context of circulation, there is a context of reception. Maybe before I go into the concrete examples from rural sociology, village studies, and women in Indian society, I will just give you an analogy, a kind of comparison. Say when we see a film or we watch a television serial, or nowadays even news looks like a serial, we look at the context of production. See a good film, who has produced it, who has directed it, where has it been shot, context of production. Context of circulation, who is it meant for? Like at one point, Bollywood started making films primarily for non-resident Indians. And so the context, what is their market? Who is receiving them? Context of reception. Who is receiving them? How are we reacting them? Do we like it? Is the TRP good? Now, in films and in television programs, maybe this seems very obvious. The story, however, even when we look at something very academic, like theories and methods, is not so different. You have context of production. You have context of circulation. Who produced the theory, say, of structural functionalism? Who produced, say, the theory of Weberian sociology or Marxist sociology, or Indian sociologists, maybe like D.P. Mukherjee or Radha Kamal Mukherjee, or maybe Ghure or Professor Yogendra Singh. What was the context of production? What were the context of circulation? Which world were these ideas circulating? And how did we receive it? How did we understand it? So even when we look at theories and methods, you may ask me, is it really relevant? I want to do my research. And why should I go into all those histories of theories and methods? Maybe I will be able to explain them a little better if I take the two concrete examples that I mentioned of rural Indian society or village studies or women in Indian society. All of you are very familiar about it. All of you also know that in Indian sociology, we've had a body of studies on village studies, using very often, like M.N. Srinivas used, Professor Bethe used, you had Professor Dubey used, very often the method of participant observation, long field work, long years spent in the field work. Why? Why did this happen? Why did they choose this? Very often they were also influenced by structural functionalism, and that showed in their study. But why? So it is important to look at the context of their production and how that influences. Because theory often shapes the methodological questions that we ask. Now, in a typical textbook method, all of us know it, all of us teach it and talk about it. The relationship between theory and method is not very complicated. In actual terms, the relationship between theory and method is complicated. Textbook treatment will say that methods are used to generate data used to test. Now, it may seem very simple, but it is not simple. What data are we trying to find? Because the data that we are going to collect will depend upon the kind of questions that we are asking. It will depend upon the people who will be interviewing. It will be depending upon the size of a sample. It will be depending upon which part of the village we've gone to or not gone to. So here the relationship between theory and method becomes extremely complicated. It is not so simple that we have identified a sample, identified problem, identified research question or hypothesis, decided on deductive, inductive logic, qualitative or quantitative measures, data compilation and analysis. This is a typical textbook study. It may seem simple, but it is not so exciting, and it's not so exciting because actual research doesn't quite take place in that fashion. All of you who've done research would let you know that I went to the field, people refused to talk to me. I went to the field, people started asking me questions instead of giving replies. I asked them about their income, they hid. They pretended they didn't know. That is, field work is far more complicated. And it is far more complicated because the nature of society is far more complicated. Before I go on to the story of village studies in India, the theory and method and empirical research in village studies, I'll give a simple example from women's studies, which with some of you may be familiar, particularly in today's world where, the crisis of the COVID-19 and the crisis for the middle class people who are used to domestic help or doing domestic work, housework yourself. So there was a large scale sample survey done. This survey was done in the United Kingdom, in Britain. And the survey wanted to map out whether men and women gender equality has improved or not improved. And they did a large scale survey, and the kind of questions that they asked were, do you believe in gender equality? Everybody said yes. Others, they asked that should women work? Everybody said yes. They asked, should men and women help each other in running household? Everybody said yes. At the end of the sample, at the end of getting the data, they found gender equality was perfect. Everybody was willing to help. Everybody said it's a desirable goal. But actual experiential reality suggested that perhaps is not completely true. What went wrong? Were people just lying? I don't think people were just lying. There was something more complicated. And they felt that the questions that they asked were the wrong kind of questions. The questions that they asked were questions to map their attitudes, what they believe in. So do you believe in gender equality? Yes, I believe. In a world where it is correct or legitimate or politically correct to say that we believe in gender equality, everybody will say we believe in gender equality. The focus for sociology or social anthropology is not just what you believe, but what you practice, what you do, not just what you say. And so they changed the set of questions. Instead of asking, do you believe in gender equality, etc., they asked, how much sugar is used in your house in a month? How many times do your children's school organize parents-teachers meeting? They started asking, how often do you have to replace the butter in your fridge? They started asking what we call empirical questions. They started asking, when was the last vaccination done for your child? Now, once you then tabulated the responses to these empirical questions, the findings were very, very different. The findings were completely different. They found out what was actually taking place. So the questions that you have to ask, you have to be not just about attitudes. Very often in contemporary times, when you influence a great deal by market research, we try to find attitudes. But more than attitudes, you have to look at actual practices. And if there is a gap between practices and the ideas you hold, just don't blame the respondents by saying, look, they are lying. But ask them, why are they lying? Is there a reason for them to lie? And maybe if you try to explore why they are lying, you will find out more about society than you would otherwise. The gap between their belief and practice will perhaps tell you a little more. So the ideal textbook representation of theory, method, and empirical research is very simple. The actual doing of it is far more complicated. Now, if we therefore go back to the history of research done in our own country, say through the example of women's studies and through the example of village society or sociology or rural society, we may be able to find out a little more and ask them how did what happened. Now, we have to therefore go back, just 1 second, I think I typed, yeah. Now let's go back to rural India and village society and say, what do we learn from it? One way of saying is that, look here, we have a lot of studies of villages and we have a lot of studies of rural India. And when we do a PhD or when we write a particular thesis, there is always a section on review of literature. And very often we do a review of literature because you're supposed to do a review of literature. People, the examiner will ask, after review of literature, kahan pe hai? So you do a review of literature. But obviously there is a logic which is far deeper. Why do we do a review of literature? Why should we have to go and read M.N. Srinivas, Andre Bite, S.C. Dubey? Why do we have to go back and study their work on village studies, Professor Chauhan? Why do we have to go and study them? Because when we study other literature, especially of such great scholars, we learn about the theory that they applied, why they applied, the methods they chose, and the inquiry that they did of the empirical reality. We also get a historical perspective of what did the village look in the 1950s, in the 1960s, and how different the villages are today. We have the hindsight of a historical approach. We have the hindsight of the limits and strengths of their theory and their empirical research and the methods they put. Now, given this, I would like to go and say, why did so much study take place on the village? Was it random? Why did they study so many villages? And I sort of would like to provoke you and ask you, just do a random study, maybe whichever college or university that you are in, and say, what kind of studies took place in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, in the 2000s, 2010, 2020. I'm sure all of you are aware that within a year, we'll have a flood of studies on COVID-19 and society. So there are contexts within particular studies emerge. Now, village studies in India got a huge boom after India's independence. And many of the studies were done by social anthropologists. And the argument being put forward was that usually social anthropologists studied simple societies, Trobriand Islanders, Andaman society, the Nagas, the Mizos, and they studied what would be called tribes. That this is a simple society, this is how elementary forms of social life existed. But the tribes had slowly started changing. And there was a renewed interest post-World War II to the study of peasantry, arguing that many of the newly independent states across Africa, Asia, Latin America, you had huge amounts of what would be village society, and the peasants were seen as the crucial element in those societies. Village society was also seen as unchanging, as a site of tradition. It was seen as something that hadn't changed. It was a bounded entity. And anthropologists, when they studied qualitative studies, ethnographic, long periods in the field, assumed that their field is bounded. I mean, it's like an unstated wall around it, not connected to the outer world. That's a historical myth, because during the colonial period, our villages were very, very connected with the outside world. Pre-colonial period, also the villages were connected with the urban world. But there was a kind of Orientalist myth developed in the West about the unchanging village society in India. People who studied Indian society were trained in that scholarship. They were trained in that scholarship. They developed that particular framework to look at that village. They also often went to Western universities where the dominant theoretical approach was structural functionalism, looking at society as organic whole, holistic whole, interconnected parts connected to each other. So if you look at Professor Srinivas, he epitomized the idea where he was influenced by structural functionalism. As a social anthropologist who was influenced by participant observation, his main professional time was in newly independent India. He was involved with the idea of the role of social sociologists and social anthropologists to modernization and development. This was all taking place in the Cold War era. American policymakers were interested in promoting a modernization model which was not socialist. Remember, it was Cold War, so you didn't want the societies to become part of the Soviet era, so a different alternative notion of modernization. All of your idea about the new elite, new cultural modes of modernization and development. And all this did not happen in air. It didn't happen as something which was just taking place in the vacuum. It took place institutionally. So, for example, in the early years, there was a lot of close relationship between the Ford Foundation and planning. At that time, the Planning Commission. And here, many of the village programs emerged directly from development agencies' interests. Studies by Professor Dubey, 1955, Professor Majumdar, 1958, Louis, 1955. Louis, who studied in a Delhi village, actually wrote, this is explicit, our work was problem-oriented from the start. Among the problems were studied was housing, education, health, role of government-sponsored panchayat, consolidation programs, etc. So it was direct. Now, I have sort of gone into a lot, but I want to just go back to where I began so that you have a sense of what is it that I am trying to say. I tried to begin by saying that we must look back, step back a bit, and look at the relationship between theory, method, and empirical research. And through the study of village societies in India, we have looked at how the theory of structural functionalism, which assumed that the village was an organic whole, interrelated parts, was influenced the actual researchers of how they looked at the village. And because they were trained as social anthropologists, they preferred to have participant observation. The questions that they were asking stemmed from these orientations. Their relationship to the empirical world was therefore defined by both the theory that they were influenced by the method that they were influenced by, and in today's world, increasingly we are aware, by their class, caste, regional, national, gender location within which they were located. So, for example, Professor Bethe has written very clearly that he lived in the Brahmin section of the village, and therefore his relationship to the other marginalized communities was naturally defined by the fact that he spent his time more in a particular village. That defined his relationship to the empirical world. So, when I said the textbook definition of theory, method, and empirical relationship is very straightforward. But it is very important to go back to these studies to do a review of literature, not just because we're supposed to do a review of literature, because the examiner wants or a supervisor wants a review of literature, but a serious review of literature will help you to see the kind of theories they used and the kind of methods they used, the strength of those theory, the strength of those methods, and the drawbacks and limitations of the methods, and so that you would be able to look at the empirical reality a little better than you would otherwise, So supposing, let's turn it around and say, supposing you had a study which did take place, say, agrarian studies. In fact, a lot of economists and political scientists also studied the village. But when they studied the village, the questions they asked were very often different. So if they were influenced for, by example, a political economic approach instead of structural functionalist, they would ask about land ownership. Who owned how much land in a village? They would ask about class relationship between landowners and land tiller. They would talk about the small peasant with differential access to land. Questions would change. The questions of your research design would be very much influenced by the questions that are raised by the theoretical orientations in which you are. These issues have become very pronounced in the contemporary period. In the contemporary period, there have been the growth of two approaches which have questioned the theory, method, and empirical research of both village studies and other kind of studies which have been done in our country. One is the whole question of the anti-caste social movements, Dalit sociology, the emergence of looking at the questions from what would be called the bottom-up approach. Why were not certain kind of questions asked? And from the women's studies approach or the feminist approach, say, why were not certain kind of questions asked? I'll give you a concrete example. If you have a questionnaire, you will have head of household, first question. And you will say, normally, your common sense assumption would be that the head of the household has to be a man. But studies which were done inspired by women's studies found out that a lot of villages, a lot of households were run actually by women, women-headed households. So if you ask the head of the house, assume that it was a man, you may be approaching your data in a completely wrong fashion. If you ask the questions like we asked in the United Kingdom study of gender equality, you may get completely wrong kind of data. So when I say go back to the question of theory, method, and empirical research, I am asking you to do your review of literature more seriously so that when you go to the field, you are aware of the past work that has been done. Now, I gave you a broad idea about rural studies and in the context within which village studies emerged, the theory they were influenced in, the political, international political context they were interested in, the focus on modernization, the idea that the village was tradition, the dichotomy between modernization and tradition, which so influenced our sociology of India, was very much present. Now look at women's studies. You know, when I was a student, when I first joined the university as a student 40 years ago, there was nothing called women's studies. Very difficult for a young generation to believe. And we knew nothing about gender. The only time we thought about gender was in the case of Ling, you know, in the grammar books, masculine, feminine, neuter, nothing more than that. Gender just meant that. Look how the world has changed. Context and concept. Gender is a concept. That concept didn't exist before in my lifetime. In my lifetime, I've seen wherever I go to speak, everybody knows what is gender. How did that happen? Remember that slide when I said context of production, context of circulation, context of reception. It happened because you firstly had women's studies, women's movement, new ICSSR, UGC, accepting this as a new field. You had women's studies programs coming up in colleges and universities. You had intellectual and institutional mechanism by which this concept spread and moved to different parts. But even this has a particular history. So when I started studying in my early days for my MPhil on women's studies, sociology of women's studies only talked about role conflict. They didn't talk about how that Indian women have started to work, and now that they've started to work, how would they manage work and home balance, etc., and what kind of role conflict could take place. Now look at that carefully. Most Indian women actually work, always worked. If you go in a train, as we would go as children, we would see women working on the field. We would see women working on construction sites, or women building railway sites, carrying bricks and stones on their head. We would see women in animal husbandry washing buffaloes. In the northeastern parts of India where I come from, we would see women looking after their piggery, weaving. We would see women doing lots of work. In our own homes, middle class homes, we would see women working as domestic workers, washing, cleaning. We would see our own mothers doing work. But the fact that we did not see that vast number of women who already worked in the public field meant a theoretical question. That theoretical question is called cognitive invisibility. What do we mean by cognitive invisibility? Cognitive invisibility means we could physically see them working. We could see the woman washing the buffalo. We could see the woman collecting fodder for the animals. We could see her collecting fodder for fuel for cooking. We could see them in extended agricultural occupation, artisanal activities, in pottery. We could physically see them. If we could physically see them, where did they disappear when we had our census? The census discussion after the late 1970s, after the document towards women's equality, which came out in 1975, status report, a lot of scholars started asking, how did this cognitive invisibility take place? We can see them physically, then why are they not counted in our census? And the question was that how will they be counted when there is a problem with the category work, concept work, word work? We mean work only when it is the kind of work I am doing as a government servant, as a university professor who has a salary, formal sector, regular salary, organized sector. We don't count work in the unorganized sector, informal sector, etc. So the problem was the cognitive invisibility because of the category work. How do we define work? So the definition has real implication. Theory has real implications. Very often in classes, we feel कि ये क्या फायदा है theory पढ़ के? What is the relevance of theory? It has no meaning. Wo bhi Western theory, what relevance does it have? Take this simple example of work, concept of work, and how that concept, unless we are clear about how we define it, our method will be wrong, our data collection will be wrong. So they realized that swift counting will not matter. We have to change the way we count, because after all, we can't collect data in raw hands. We can't go to the field and just collect the data in our hands. We have to collect them through categories, through concepts. So it is very important to be very, very familiar with those concepts. We can then ask, why then were we only focusing on role conflicts? For that, we have to go back to structural functionalism, Talcott Parson, who you may feel ki bahut dur ki baat hai, American sociologists of the 1940s and 50s, but he was actually present here. Lot of our early Indian sociologists were taught and trained by the Parsonian structural functionalism. When I was introduced, they said I teach in the Center for the Study of Social Systems. The idea of social systems comes from that. I was speaking, I think, to Professor Karna from Patna, and he was mentioning about American sociologists who came and actually taught in Patna universities at that time, and many of them were trained by structural functionalism. And in Parsons' framework, men do the instrumental functions. If you go back to Parsons and check, you'll find men do the instrumental function. Women do the expressive function, the caring functions, which we are aware of. Now, if you have that kind of framework and you say then women also start working, then the role conflict will be the natural frame of reference. Also, your natural location will make you look at women who are like you, not like at women who don't look like you, are not women like you. Our cognitive frameworks are very important to look at, when we start looking at, like say in COVID-19, we talked about lockdown. And the main thing we started coming on television in the initial phrases was, how do you spend time at home? So people started sharing pictures of the food they cook, etc. Domesticity, middle class, urban domesticity. Only when the crisis of the migrants sort of started staring at our face, then we realized, oh, there was a cognitive invisibility. Other people have other issues because of the same phenomenon. So theory is not just learning definitions. Theory is a way by which we become very aware and conscious of our natural, so to say, natural or ability to look at the world. Why did we miss it out? It helps us to ask that. Why did we only do village studies? Why did we not look at agrarian relations and were more interested in community life or the way that the people lived in those periods of time? We start asking the whys. And when you start asking the whys, I promise you, your research design will automatically get better, more informed. And new questions, new theories, and new methods will emerge. For example, with women's studies, there began the whole question of narratives. Autobiographies. People rediscovered. I don't know how many of you have seen these two wonderful books brought out by Susie Tharu and K. Lalita on women's writing in India from 6th century BC, from the Buddhist period, about how women wrote about their lives. Is that data going to help us? Can we have an entry into that world? Very complicated. The field is complicated. Theory is complicated, but it is also fun if we do it in a particular way. Now I sort of shift gear because my entire effort was to show the relationship between theory and method and empirical research. I gave two concrete examples: rural society, rural sociology, village society, and women's studies, to show to you how these relationships are defined. And now I come to a very simple point, that are there truths that nature hands out? Obvious, self-evident. Is the reality self-evident? Can we just take the reality, capture it, and put it in our pockets? And sociology or social science teachers know, and Weber argues, it is not unfiltered by prior ideas. We already have ideas in our head. That's why in all sociology textbooks, you begin with the distinction between common sense sociology and sociological knowledge. We already have ideas. Say, take the term family. When somebody says family, I immediately think of families like I have, the kind of families my relatives have, the kind of families the middle class families of the region that I come from have. These are prior ideas. So I'm a little shocked maybe when we hear in COVID-19 times that their domestic violence has increased during COVID-19, which means families are different. There are different kinds of families, different kinds of relationships. And this is not a normative point that good families are bad families. It is about the historically constituted nature of families. Which kind of families emerge in which kind of society? Why do we have large extended families in landed section in our village, or used to? And why did we have smaller families in groups which were dependent maybe on wage labor? Very different kinds of questions, not questions of good family or bad family, but questions of how families are historically determined and constituted in very different kinds of ways. Weber therefore tried to bring in terms like ideal types, social action, causal relationships, comparative method, to show, to basically destabilize or shake the taken for granted or are ordinary, or within quotes, unnatural ways of looking at it. All the classical thinkers looked at it. Very often people say, itne saal baad, what's the point of doing Weber, Marx, and Durkheim? Actually, they are classical because there is a certain relevance that stays with them. And they were talking about modern societies. Unfortunately, we are still in that kind of crisis of modern societies in this pandemic era. And to go back is important not only because of their commentary, but because of the methods and theories that they developed in order to shake us from our taken for granted assumption. All of you are familiar with Durkheim's rules of sociological method. And the first thing he says is get rid of preconception. That don't approach reality, empirical reality, with the ideas that you have in your mind. Preconceptions, family, we must study family. So I have ideas of what a good family is. I go to a family which seems to be dysfunctional from my perspective. That would be the wrong approach. What I would say, why are their families different from my families? What is it about a comparative perspective? So Durkheim's, when he says social facts as things, it is not just, very often we, in our common sense way, mean social facts as things, meaning that we must treat it like stones and we must treat it like pebbles and fat. That's not what he's saying. He's saying when we treat it as a thing, we are getting rid of the preconceived ideas that we had about the thing. For example, if we have an idea about a particular community, कि बहुत आलसी है. Now, that is going to be a problem if we try to approach the field with that idea. But if we try to see why are their ideas of work and leisure so different from mine, then I'll have a sociological question. So social facts, external, coercive, imposes upon us if you resist, is actually helping us to look at it. I'll give you a personal example maybe to illustrate this. Many, many years ago, I was speaking on some women-related issues, and I was looking at Durkheim and I asked the members that, do you think dowry is a social fact? External, coercive, general, if you don't practice it, there may be, sanctions. And everybody in the room said, nahi, it's not a social fact. हम तो प्यार से dowry देते हैं, इस पे कोई जबरदस्ती नहीं है. It is out of our love and affection that we do it. So I asked if it is out of love and affection, you can give it 1 year later on the anniversary. And they said, नहीं, ये कैसा हो सकता? डर लगते हैं. And when they say डर, it means it is external, coercive. शायद अगर हम ना दे, शायद कुछ हो सकता. एक घबराहट महसूस होता. It's important to look at that dynamics. To Durkheim's social fact is not just something you learn up for an exam, but it is something which will help you in your research design, which will help you to go into the empirical reality. Therefore, he says, look at indicators, external observations of indicators. Look at law, look at statistics, and then try to understand social reality. Don't go by attitudes, like I said, as it exists, as practices. Remember the example I talked to you about gender. And these indicators, all of you are familiar with what indicators are important because they exist independently of our individual wills. It gives us an objective entity with which we deal. It also tells future scholars that my field study showed something else, and people will ask, what indicators did you use? Did you use the same set of indicators the earlier scholar used? And you'll be able to find out that the empirical reality looks a little different depending upon the indicators. So all our classical thinkers, whether it's Weber, whether it's Durkheim, whether it's Marx, brought attention to the fact that, okay, how do we start our study? How do we begin? So if you look at social facts of Durkheim, if you look at ideal types of Weber, and if you look at Marx's mode of production, they're all saying the same thing to the sense that we have to, where do we begin? So Marx's ideas don't begin with the ideas that you have, very much like Durkheim. If you compare German ideology in some sections of rules, it's uncanny resemblance. He says it must begin from how people actually live in the physical organization, not what people are saying to you, but how do they actually live? The physical organization of how they live. What do they do? What kind of production do they do? Like, I'm a teacher, what I produce is my lecture. Very different from somebody who is working on the field and producing the crops. And then he goes on to say that what we are depends upon what we produce. So how I live, how I talk, how I speak depends upon the material forms of production within which we are located. Very different from the lives of the migrants who may be still trying to go back home. Completely different. So it is this beginning that unless we have a theoretical clarity, we will not be in a position to have a very good research. The moot question of objectivity. A lot of people will say, "Up objectively." What is objectivity? None of us are totally objective. How can we be objective? We are subjective human beings. It is theory methods which teach us how to navigate the path of objectivity. Why did we miss it out? Those are research questions. Why did we miss out women workers? Why did we miss out a particular community in the village which we were studying? And the question here is not whether I personally am neutral or not neutral. None of us are neutral. But whether our research design gives the possibility of, to the possible extent, of not getting into the problem of cognitive invisibility. A final problem, because a lot of our syllabi have social problems, and the main thing that sociology has taught us, that a problem is always, that we have to be wary and careful to know that a problem doesn't always exist there. It just doesn't exist there. That, look, there is a problem. Let's bring that problem and resolve the problem. Say in women's studies, I would say divorce is a problem. But you can turn around and say that there were a lot of broken marriages, honor killing in an earlier period. Is divorce a problem? Or could the problem be a kind of differential gender expectations and tensions which take place in the image? So the important point is not to approach anything from the conceptions or ideas or values which we have, but look at theory, method very, very seriously. Therefore, it's perhaps not unimportant to go back to a very fundamental methodological question of the debate between natural science and social sciences. Is it relevant? I think it is relevant even today. It's become much more sophisticated as the years have gone. And if you've noticed, the question of cognitive invisibility, which we used with reference to the question of women's work, a lot of people have raised it, the question of Dalit situation, that the cognitive invisibility is inbuilt into the category. So we have to talk about the specificity of social life, that we as human beings are products of society, but we also change it. Knowledge is continuously accumulating. It is not fixed. Theory is not fixed. Method is not fixed. We have to unfreeze it. We have to see it as a process. Only if we see it as a process, we'll be able to go and see it. I'll give you a small point, last point, to explain what I mean of accumulative knowledge and how knowledge can go back and revisit older scholarship and look at it differently. Say Sanskritization is a concept which is taught in all our colleges and universities. And when I studied Sanskritization, we talked about, that how you adopt customs of a so-called upper caste and you have a positional mobility, etc. We did not see in it any gendered connotation, nor did we see it as a privileging of a particular community or not. 40 years later, both issues are discussed in great detail. I, for example, never even thought about the gender dimension until many, many decades later. That when you say the Sanskritization is adopting customs, becoming vegetarian, and withdrawing women from work in order to have greater social esteem, who is withdrawing? Women couldn't be withdrawing women from work. It could only be men withdrawing from work. In this small one-liner, you have theoretical domain assumptions of who are we talking, who is being Sanskritized. It is gendered. So new knowledges help us to look at it. So don't think of theory as a box, definitions which you have to look at. Theory is like a film. It opens up the world to you. It opens up how we look at the world around us, at ourselves, at our own biases, at the construction of our biases, at the construction of others' biases, and see whether we can have a research design which helps us to omit as much as possible, never foolproof, because it's a process, it's not fixed. I will stop here. I don't know how much time I took, but thank you again very much. Thank you for this opportunity, Sanjeev.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you. It was excellent. And today I really want to say that this is the difference, that we could not get chance to get lectures from people like you daily, and that is the difference why probably we could not become such good researchers as even if we want to, because we could not get the theoretical explanation of these issues like what we have got today. I hope that some of my delegates will also share their observations. And before I ask the participants to raise few questions, Dr. R.K. Sharma, sir, he's my fellow colleague from the department. Sir.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Thank you, ma'am. आपने बहुत ही अच्छे पॉइंट्स हमको जो फील्ड के बारे में, रिसर्च के बारे में जो बताए. Actually, books or theoretical knowledge is available in the books, but the experiences we are getting in this workshop with interacting with so many scholars, those who have really worked in the field. So that is the most important thing we are getting. For example, how the question should be framed, and how we can get closer to the realities. So the practicalities, we get the information, the knowledge, जो कि एक true research experience से ही प्राप्त हो सकती है. तो वो जो benefit उस workshop में मैं देख रहा हूँ कि जो besides theoretical things, जो एक experiences की जो चीज है, वो केवल आप लोगों से जान करके ही, आपके experiences को share करके ही हम लोगों को वो benefit हो सकता है. Thank you very much, ma'am, for enlightening us on different issues, how methods and theories they help in constructing our research synopsis and all these things, and how they help us in framing our questionnaires and interview schedules. All these things are related to each other: method, theory, empirical research, and all these things. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, ma'am, I just, there are a few questions which have come up. I'll take one by one. Etre Malik, she's saying that, ma'am, a study is based on identifying the stress factors among adolescents and how BMI or body mass index is associated with it. Suppose after analyzing sensors or SEM model has been framed. My question is, to fit my model in both theoretical and conceptual framework, how empirical evidences help to give the strength of building the model? The study is quantitative in nature.
Yeah, I don't know whether I'm the right person to answer, but I would just want to make a point कि आप जबरदस्ती you can't fit empirical detail into model. वो कोशिश करना भी नहीं चाहिए. What would be more interesting is that you can do your quantitative study about what is the relationship, but वो quantitative study के साथ you should also look into why is this whole question so important for young adolescent women. You should read up maybe a lot of research which has been done on adolescent women and the kind of tension and pressure which is there in a mediatized world today, and that knowledge will help you. वो fit करने का कोशिश बिल्कुल मत कीजिए, because the most interesting thing is that which does not fit. कि फिर उससे जैसे आपने कहा, that will probably give you more.
Thank you, ma'am. Neha Mishra says, first of all, thank you so much, ma'am, for such an enriched lecture. The question that I would like to ask is, in my research, I'm trying to study the lives of the women who are involved in low-skilled jobs in tourism sector. However, the women doesn't tend to get open and feel hesitated while replying. So how could we can bridge the communication gap between researcher and respondents?
Very good question. Yeah. एक तो time चाहिए, जो what we call the rapport building. You can't just go and ask questions because they will find it strange. I just want to share, आप उनको सवाल पूछने दीजिए पहले. if you give them the scope to ask you questions in return, it will develop a certain kind of rapport. They will open up, and also try and have group discussions. एक साथ मिलके चाय पी के बात करना, उससे ज़्यादा, you will get much better information than a straight question and answer. Can I, Sanjeev, just give a small detour, an example to show the problem? There was a very interesting study done on two sets of women. One set of women was poor women and one set of women was middle class women. Those poor women थे, तो they wanted to know कि आप अपना life story बताइए. And middle class women also, they said आपका biography बताइए. Now, first thing is the middle class person will know what biography is, life story is. Other person won't know. The middle class, they found out in the response, the middle class woman would begin very chronological. I was born on such and such a place. My parents did this. Bilkul jaise academic style. I went to this school. I went to college. I took this subject. I got married. I did work. Narrative chronologically, which is a very modern way of looking at it. So poorer women, वो कहीं पे कहीं चले जाते थे. Okay, they may begin from the contemporaries. हाँ, मेरे बचपन में ये हुआ था. मेरे माँ ने ये कहा था. Now that means that even how we speak, our language is linked to who we are. And जो researcher है, उनको language पे बहुत ध्यान देना पड़ेगा. That are you speaking in the language, not just I'm talking about English or Hindi, but in the words that they use, in the life experience that they use. So I would suggest to you, थोड़ा सा time निकाल के उनके साथ you spend, I think that would give you a lot more information. And supposing you feel they're lying, तो उसको आप मत सोचिए कि ये गलत है, डेटा ही नहीं है. Lies भी डेटा होता, छुपाते क्यों है? That will lead you to more questions or more findings.
Excellent, ma'am. Thank you very much. One of the participants has written that please consider my question raised on YouTube, and she's kept keeping me on my toes. I found her question on the YouTube, which says that how important is to pick the research problem from literature review. How do you compare it with other ways of reaching to a research problem?
It's not an either or. I didn't understand the YouTube thing. Kya matlab?
Ma'am, it was coming on, the lecture is coming on live on YouTube. So she said, she has put up the question on YouTube and she said me in this Zoom to find out my question on the YouTube. Yeah.
Yeah. I keep telling my students, I'll give you my own example. I took a topic, I was going to work for my PhD on trade union movement in Bombay, textile. मैंने 2 साल काम किया, कुछ हुआ ही नहीं. छोड़ दिया. I wasted 2 years in that. And when I look back and I said, why did that happen? The explanation is that my heart was not in it. I think you have to take a topic which you feel very passionately about. So because PhD बहुत लंबी होती है, boring भी हो जाती है, tiring होता, lonely होता. So you should take a topic which matters to you. But that topic will then be pursued by review of literature in the field. So you have to look at both dimensions.
Thank you, ma'am. Mary John Sajeev, she asks, do female writers undergo a split personality in their writings because of the various gender role they play at the same time?
I don't know whether it's a split or whether it's an add-on. Let me say that it's an add-on. Because I'll give you a small example. I give a lot of these examples to people, that because you're gendered in a particular way when you grow up as a young girl, young woman, I know things have changed a lot since my time. You are taught that jada mat bolo, you observe more, so you have certain, I wouldn't call split, I would call that it gives you certain added dimension to life. And I would look at it. Of course, it's challenging, it's more difficult. Like I would have liked to come to Meerut more often, but domestic responsibilities, you can't. All that is fine. But I wouldn't use the word split. I would use an added, perspective.
Thank you, ma'am. Another question by Moy Miran, Nagaland. I think I have pronounced her name correct. I'm working on status of women in tribal traditional political institutions. what I found is status of women is better in the village without female representation in village council. Majority are satisfied with the present arrangements. How will I go ahead with the gender parity issue in political representation?
I don't know, how you found that, because say there's a lot of work on Nagaland and the whole question of village council. And there was actually, I mean, you would know better, the young scholar who was asked, a lot of dispute about representation of women in the village council. It was a huge debate, debated within Naga media, Naga newspapers. So if you go and ask them, are you satisfied? And if they say, yes, we are satisfied, no, that's not how you'll go about it. You will have to find out in a more complicated fashion, do they feel deprived or not? Would they like to be in it? If they are satisfied, who are the people who are saying they're satisfied? You shouldn't go by their yes, no answer. Particularly in the Nagaland, because it was a huge issue, the question of women's representation.
Thank you, ma'am. One last for the day. Sujani Paruchiri. Hello, ma'am. I understand that theoretical base is important for carrying out any research. My question is, when there are too many theories available on a specific phenomena, how will we know which one is most applicable as far as our thing is concerned?
I wasn't able to, distinguish in my presentation the question of middle range, what we call middle range theory. And macro theories, So I think that it's not that you have to apply all theory. That is not what I'm trying to say at all, that you have to apply all theory. But theories will help you to decide what kind of questions you will ask. So it is not necessary that you say, okay, I am applying a Weberian approach, or I'm using so-and-so theorists to my study. That is not what is necessary. What is more necessary is that when you use this, read those theories, if you can pick up the questions which a particular theorist would raise and the kind of questions which a particular theorist wouldn't raise. For example, I mean, like I say, the gender question is most visible. If it is not raised in many of the traditional theorists, and you find that in some feminist theory it is raised, you can always broach upon that and take that, So it is not that, what do I choose? This question actually won't occur if you start getting really involved in maybe some of empirical researches which I've used, So it is not an either or, nor is it I have to exclusively use this and not that. You can use different concepts from different kinds of theories, but you have to be very clear, where do I begin? And one advice I would have, don't begin with what they're responding to your questions.
Thank you.
Responses are a problem, yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much, ma'am. Now I request Hemchand to please deliver the vote of thanks. Hemchand.
Okay, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. Respected Honorable Principal, sir, management team, expert speaker for this session, Professor Maitrayee Chaudhuri, Dr. Sanjeev Mahajan, sir, Dr. Sanjay, sir, and all the participants. I am feeling honored to get this opportunity to convey a vote of thanks for this session of this national workshop on research methodology. This session is very useful, and we all got opportunity to make aware ourselves about empirical research methods and theory. Organizing national workshop is a challenging task. This cannot be possible without a great preparation, support from every corners, and blessings. It's time to convey our gratitude to all who have extended their support to make this event successful. I would like to thank Dr. Sanjay sir for his immense support and guidance. At the outset, on behalf of organizing committee, I would like to express my profound gratitude to Dr. Sanjeev Mahajan sir, HOD Sociology Department, NAS College Meerut, for organizing such kinds of workshop. I most humbly thank to respected Principal Sir for his blessings and motivations. My words may not be capable to express our sense of gratitude to this session expert, Professor Maitrayee Chaudhuri. During the lecture, she has covered up various aspects of research, such as the importance of theory and methods in empirical research, the relationship between theory and methods in an easy and understandable way, with several examples. She has also talked about the importance of literature review in research and Durkheim rules of sociological methods. Thanks a lot, ma'am, for adjusting your busy schedule and sharing your knowledge and experience with us. I believe this workshop has opened a new dimensions to all the stakeholders. At the end, I would like to thank all the participants of this national workshop for their active engagement, participation, and discipline. Thank you. Now over to Dr. Sanjeev sir. Sir, please.
Again, on behalf of IGNOR Regional Center and my college, I'm really thankful to Professor Maitrayee Chaudhuri ma'am. I know how busy she is and she spared time for us. I'll be always indebted to ma'am for your valuable words, for your valuable lecture, and I hope that all the participants have highly benefited from your insightful lecture. Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.